Why Alexander the Great was preserved in honey. You've probably heard a lot about Alexander the Great, the undefeated conqueror, the man who built one of the largest empires in history before turning 33. But what most people don't realize is that his story didn't end with his death. In fact, what happened after he died might be even more mysterious than his life. Because according to ancient sources, Alexander's body wasn't buried right away. It was preserved. And not just preserved in any ordinary way. It was placed in honey. Yeah, honey. Now that sounds strange at first. Almost like a myth. But when you start digging deeper into the history, it becomes a lot more interesting, and a lot more believable. So let's start from the moment everything changed. Alexander died in 323 BCE, in the city of Babylon, a place that was once one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. He had just returned from years of brutal campaigns, stretching his empire from Greece all the way to India. At that point, he was basically unstoppable. No army could defeat him. No king could match him. But then suddenly, he got sick. Ancient historians like Plutarch and Arrian describe how Alexander developed a fever. At first, it didn't seem too serious. But day by day, it got worse. He lost the ability to speak clearly. He became weaker. Eventually, he couldn't even move. And within about 10 days, the most powerful man in the world was gone. Now here's where things get really strange. Normally, in the ancient world, bodies would start decomposing quickly, especially in a hot place like Babylon. But Alexander's body didn't. Days passed, and there were no clear signs of decay. No smell. No visible breakdown. People were shocked. Some even believed this was proof that Alexander was divine, that he wasn't just a man. But others had a more practical explanation. They believed something had been done to preserve the body. And this is where honey comes in. In the ancient world, honey wasn't just food. It was considered almost magical. It has natural antibacterial properties. It can prevent the growth of microbes. And under the right conditions, it can slow down decomposition. Even today, scientists know that honey can preserve organic material for a long time. So when ancient writers mention that Alexander's body may have been placed in honey, it wasn't as crazy as it sounds. In fact, it might have been one of the best preservation methods available at the time. But why go through all that effort? Why preserve his body at all? The answer lies in what happened next. Because the moment Alexander died, his empire didn't just peacefully pass on to someone else. It collapsed into chaos. Alexander didn't leave a clear heir. There was no strong successor ready to take control. So his generals, the men who had fought alongside him for years, started turning against each other. These men are known in history as the Diadochi, meaning successors. Among them were powerful figures like Ptolemy I Soter and Seleucus I Nicator. Each one wanted a piece of Alexander's empire. Each one wanted power. And surprisingly, Alexander's dead body became a key part of that power struggle. Because controlling Alexander's body wasn't just symbolic. It was political. Whoever possessed his body could claim legitimacy. They could say, "I am the true successor of Alexander." So preserving his body wasn't just about respect. It was about strategy. At first, there were plans to send Alexander's body back to Macedonia, his homeland. A massive funeral carriage was prepared. It was said to be incredibly elaborate, covered in gold, decorated with statues, and designed to show the world just how powerful Alexander had been. The journey was supposed to be grand. A final procession worthy of a king. But the body never made it back to Macedonia. Because along the way, something unexpected happened. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's former generals, intercepted the funeral procession. He took control of the body, and instead of sending it to Macedonia, he brought it to Egypt. This was a bold move. A risky one. But also, a brilliant one. Because Egypt was one of the richest and most important regions of Alexander's empire. And by bringing Alexander's body there, Ptolemy was essentially saying, "This is where Alexander belongs now. This is where his legacy continues." And once the body arrived in Egypt, it became something even bigger than before. It became a symbol of power, a symbol of legitimacy, a symbol of connection to the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen. But here's the question that still fascinates historians today. Was Alexander really preserved in honey during all this time? Or is that just a story that grew over time? Because while several ancient accounts suggest unusual preservation methods, they don't all agree on the details. Some mention embalming techniques similar to Egyptian mummification. Others hint at substances like oils or resins. And then, there are those references to honey. If it's true, then it means Alexander's body was carefully protected during a long and dangerous journey across the ancient world. A journey filled with political tension, power struggles, and uncertainty. And somehow, his body remained intact through it all. But the mystery doesn't end there. Because even after reaching Egypt, Alexander's body didn't stay in one place forever. It was moved again, displayed, visited, admired. Even centuries later, powerful rulers would come just to see him. To stand in front of the body of a man who had once conquered half the known world. And that raises another question. What happened to Alexander's body in the end? Because today, no one knows where it is. It's completely lost. No confirmed tomb. No verified remains. Just theories, legends, and unanswered questions. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. It's not just about how Alexander lived. It's about how his legacy continued, even after death. Through power struggles. Through myths. Through stories like the one about honey. So now we're standing at a really interesting point in the story. Alexander is dead. His empire is falling apart. And his body has become one of the most valuable things in the ancient world. But the big question still remains. Was honey actually used to preserve his body, or is that just a legend? To understand that, we need to step away from the politics for a moment. And look at something more practical. We need to look at science. Because even thousands of years ago, people understood something important about honey. They may not have had microscopes. They didn't know about bacteria the way we do today. But they observed things. And what they observed was simple. Honey doesn't spoil. In fact, jars of honey have been found in ancient tombs, especially in places like ancient Egypt, that are still preserved even after thousands of years. Still edible. Still intact. That's not normal for food. And there's a reason for that. Honey has extremely low moisture content. That means bacteria can't grow easily inside it. It's also naturally acidic, which makes it even harder for microbes to survive. And on top of that, Honey produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide, basically acting like a natural disinfectant. So when something is submerged in honey, it's almost like putting it in a protective barrier. A barrier that slows down decay. Now imagine ancient people noticing this. They see that honey preserves food. They see that it prevents rot. So what happens when they need to preserve something much more important, like the body of a king? They use what they know works. There are even historical stories, not just about Alexander, where bodies were preserved in honey. Some ancient accounts claim that famous leaders or nobles were transported long distances in containers filled with honey to prevent decomposition. So the idea itself isn't impossible. It actually fits perfectly with what people at the time understood. But here's where things get even more interesting. Because Alexander didn't die in Egypt. He died in Babylon. And Babylon had its own traditions, very different from Egyptian ones. Meanwhile, Egypt, especially under rulers like Ptolemy Sota, was famous for something else. Mummification. A completely different method of preserving bodies. In Egypt, preservation wasn't just practical. It was deeply religious. They believed the body had to be preserved for the soul to survive in the afterlife. So they developed incredibly advanced techniques. They would remove internal organs, dry the body using natron, a type of salt, wrap it carefully in linen, and over time, this process became extremely refined. Now think about this. Alexander's body starts in Babylon, but ends up in Egypt. So it's very possible that two different preservation methods were involved. One theory is this. At first, his body was preserved temporarily, possibly using honey or similar substances to stop decay. Why? Because transporting a body across long distances in the ancient world took time. Weeks, even months. And without preservation, the body wouldn't last. Then, once the body reached Egypt, it could have been retreated using Egyptian techniques. Possibly even fully embalmed or prepared in a way similar to a mummy. This combination would actually make a lot of sense. Temporary preservation for transport, followed by long-term preservation for display. And yes, display. Because Alexander's body wasn't just buried and forgotten. It was shown, displayed to the public, to rulers, to visitors from across the world. Centuries later, even powerful figures from the Roman world came to see him. One of them was Julius Caesar. Another was Augustus. They didn't just hear stories about Alexander. They wanted to see him with their own eyes. Imagine that for a second. Standing in front of the preserved body of a man who died hundreds of years before you were born. A man whose name still carried power. That's the level of preservation we're talking about. But there's still one more layer to this mystery. Because not all historians agree on the details. Writers like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus describe the tomb and the body, but they don't all mention honey directly. Some accounts focus more on the tomb itself. Others describe the body being placed in a glass or golden sarcophagus. So where does the honey story come from? It likely comes from a mix of sources. Some historical, some possibly exaggerated over time. Ancient storytelling wasn't always about strict accuracy. It was about meaning, symbolism, power, and honey, in many cultures, symbolized purity, preservation, even immortality. So the idea of preserving Alexander, the man who seemed almost unstoppable, in honey, fits that symbolic image perfectly. But here's the key thing. Even if every detail isn't 100% confirmed, the core idea is still very real. Alexander's body was preserved. It lasted for an incredibly long time, and it became one of the most important objects in the ancient world. And that leads us to something even bigger. Because this wasn't just about keeping a body intact. This was about controlling a legacy. Ptolemy didn't bring Alexander to Egypt just out of respect. He did it because it gave him power. Because as long as Alexander's body was in Egypt, his spirit, his authority, his legacy, felt like it was there too. And people believed in that. They believed that being close to Alexander meant something. That it gave you legitimacy. That it made your rule stronger. So preserving his body wasn't just science. It was politics. It was psychology. It was power. But the story still isn't over. Because even after being preserved, displayed, and admired for centuries, Alexander's body eventually disappeared. Completely. No one knows exactly when. No one knows exactly how. And that's where the mystery becomes even deeper. Because how does something so important, something so carefully preserved, just vanish? So now we've reached the part of the story that feels almost unbelievable. Alexander's body, preserved, protected, and displayed for centuries, just disappears. No clear record. No confirmed location. No final answer. And that's what turns this from history into a full mystery. Let's pick up where we left off. After Ptolemy I Soter brought Alexander's body to Egypt. It didn't stay hidden. It became one of the most famous attractions of the ancient world. The body was eventually placed in the city of Alexandria, a city founded by Alexander himself. That alone is powerful. It's almost poetic. The conqueror returns, not as a king, but as a symbol. And in Alexandria, his tomb became known as the Soma or Sema. This wasn't just a grave. It was more like a monument. A place where people came not just to mourn, but to witness history. Ancient writers describe how visitors could actually see Alexander's body. Not just a coffin, not just a sealed tomb, but the body itself. Preserved, recognizable, still carrying the presence of a man who once ruled half the world. At some point, the original golden coffin was replaced. Why? Because gold attracts attention and danger. It's said that one of the later rulers melted it down and replaced it with glass or another transparent material. Something that still allowed people to see inside, but wasn't as tempting to steal. And the visitors kept coming. Generations passed. Empires changed, but Alexander remained. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, he made sure to visit the tomb. Not just out of curiosity, but out of admiration. Because even centuries later, Alexander was still seen as the ultimate model of power and conquest. Then came Augustus. And according to some accounts, he did something unexpected. It said that Augustus was so fascinated that he asked to see the body up close. And when he did, he accidentally damaged it. Some stories say he broke a piece off, possibly the nose. Now, whether that's completely true or slightly exaggerated, we can't be 100% sure. But the fact that stories like this exist tells you something important. The body wasn't just preserved. It was accessible. Think about that. A man who died in 323 BCE. Still visible, still present. Hundreds of years later. That's incredible. But then, something changes. As time goes on, references to the tomb start to fade. Writers mention it less and less. Descriptions become vague. And eventually, they stop completely. By the time we get to the later Roman period, no one seems to know exactly where Alexander's tomb is anymore. So what happened? How does one of the most famous tombs in the world just vanish? There are several theories, and each one feels like it could be true. The first theory is simple. Natural destruction. Alexandria wasn't a calm, stable city forever. It went through earthquakes, fires, wars, riots. Over centuries, large parts of the city were destroyed or rebuilt. So it's possible that Alexander's tomb was damaged, buried, or completely lost under layers of history. Another theory is looting. Even though the golden coffin was replaced, the tomb itself would have still been incredibly valuable. And during times of instability, looters often targeted anything connected to wealth or power. So it's possible the tomb was broken into, and whatever remained was taken or destroyed. Then there's a more mysterious idea. What if the body was moved again? Just like Ptolemy Isota took it from its original path. It's possible that later rulers relocated it for safety or secrecy. But if they did, they never left a clear record. And then there's the theory that feels almost like something out of a movie. What if Alexander's body is still out there, hidden beneath the modern city of Alexandria? Because here's the reality. Modern Alexandria is built on top of ancient Alexandria. Layers and layers of history, buried underground. And archaeologists have only explored a small part of it. So it's entirely possible that somewhere beneath the streets, beneath buildings, beneath time itself, the tomb is still there, undiscovered, waiting. There have been attempts to find it. Excavations, searches, theories. Some researchers believe they've come close. But so far, nothing has been confirmed. And that's what keeps this story alive. Because it's not finished. We know how Alexander lived. We know how he conquered. We know how he died. We even have clues about how his body was preserved, possibly in honey, possibly through advanced embalming. But we don't know where he is. And maybe that's fitting. Because Alexander was never a man who stayed in one place. He was always moving, always expanding, always chasing something beyond the horizon. And now, even in death, he remains just out of reach. A legend not just because of what he did, but because of what we still don't know. So now we're deep into the mystery. Alexander's body, once seen by emperors, displayed in one of the greatest cities on earth, is gone. No confirmed tomb. No verified remains. But here's the thing. That hasn't stopped people from searching. In fact, the search for Alexander's tomb has been going on for centuries. Let's start with the place everyone agrees on. Alexandria. This is where the body was last reliably seen. This is where the famous Soma once stood. So naturally, this is where most of the searches have focused. But there's a problem. Modern Alexandria is huge. Busy streets. Dense buildings. Millions of people. And all of it sits directly on top of the ancient city. Imagine trying to find a single tomb, buried under thousands of years of construction. It's like trying to find a needle in a mountain. Still, that hasn't stopped archaeologists. Over the years, there have been multiple excavation attempts. Some small, some large, some extremely controversial. One of the most talked about figures in this search is Dorothy Eady, also known as Seti. Now her story is unusual. Dorothy Eady believed she had memories of a past life in ancient Egypt. She claimed she had lived during the time of the pharaohs, and that she knew hidden details about ancient sites. Because of this, she became convinced that she knew where Alexander's tomb was located. She pointed to a specific area in Alexandria, and insisted that the tomb was buried beneath it. Some people dismissed her completely. Others were intrigued. What makes her story interesting is that she wasn't just making random claims. She had deep knowledge of ancient Egyptian culture, and she worked with archaeologists. So while her past life claims are debated, her insights still caught attention. But despite all the interest, no confirmed discovery was made. Then there are more traditional archaeologists. Researchers who rely purely on historical texts, maps, and physical evidence. They've studied ancient writings from historians like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus. They've tried to reconstruct where the Soma might have been located. Some believe it was in the royal district of Alexandria, a central, important area, close to other major buildings. But here's where things get complicated. Large parts of ancient Alexandria are now underwater, due to earthquakes and rising sea levels. Sections of the ancient city sank into the Mediterranean. So it's possible that Alexander's tomb, or at least part of it, is now beneath the sea. And yes, there have been underwater explorations too. Divers and researchers have found ruins, statues, even entire structures beneath the water. But so far, nothing that can be definitively linked to Alexander's tomb. Now let's look at another theory. One that takes us away from Alexandria completely. Some researchers believe Alexander might not be in Alexandria at all. That at some point, his body was moved again. Possibly in secret. One of the most surprising theories connects Alexander to a completely different historical figure. Saint Mark. According to this idea, the body believed to be Saint Mark in Venice might actually be Alexander the Great. Now that sounds wild. And yes, it's highly controversial. But here's why some people consider it. During the early Christian period, many pagan symbols and sites were reinterpreted or replaced. It's possible that Alexander's tomb was repurposed, renamed, or even mistaken for something else. In the city of Venice, the remains of Saint Mark are kept in a grand basilica. But the journey of those remains, and their original identity, is not completely clear. Some researchers argue that there are inconsistencies in the historical record. Gaps. Questions. And in those gaps, theories like this emerge. Now, is there solid proof? No. But it shows just how far the mystery goes. Another theory suggests something simpler, but just as frustrating. What if the tomb was destroyed, and the body didn't survive? Over centuries of conflict, religious change, and urban development. It's entirely possible that the tomb was dismantled, that the materials were reused, that the body itself was lost to time. It's not a dramatic answer. But sometimes, history doesn't leave behind neat endings. Still, many experts believe the tomb is still out there. Hidden. Buried. waiting. And here's why. Alexander was too important, too famous, too powerful. The idea that his tomb would just be completely erased, without any trace at all, feels unlikely. More often than not, history leaves clues. And in Alexander's case, there are still plenty of clues left. They're just scattered, incomplete, and difficult to piece together. So the search continues. Archaeologists keep digging. Researchers keep studying. New technology keeps improving. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, advanced mapping, all of these tools are being used to explore what's hidden beneath modern cities. And who knows? Maybe one day, someone will uncover a structure, a chamber, a tomb, and inside, they might find the preserved remains of a man who once changed the world. A man whose body may have been protected in honey, carried across empires, displayed to kings, and then lost to history. But until that day comes, the mystery remains. So after centuries of mystery, rumors, and failed searches, you might be wondering, are we actually any closer to finding Alexander's tomb today? Or is this just one of those legends that will never be solved? The truth is, we might be closer than ever before. And the reason isn't luck. It's technology. In the ancient world, people searched with guesswork. Later, archaeologists used maps, texts, and excavation. But today, we have tools that can literally see beneath the ground, without even digging. One of the most important tools is ground-penetrating radar. This technology sends signals into that and maps what's hidden underneath. Walls, chambers, structures, things that would normally take years to uncover, can now be detected much faster. And in places like Alexandria, this is a game changer. Because digging freely in a modern city is almost impossible. But scanning? That's different. Researchers have already used these methods to locate buried ruins beneath the streets. Entire sections of ancient Alexandria, still hidden below the surface. There's also satellite imaging. From space, scientists can detect subtle differences in patterns that suggest human-made structures. It's like seeing shadows of the past from above. And then there's underwater archaeology. Remember how parts of Alexandria sank into the sea? Well, modern divers and researchers have been exploring those submerged ruins. They found statues, columns, even palace remains. But still, no confirmed sign of Alexander. So the question becomes, if we do find the tomb, what happens next? Because this wouldn't just be another archaeological discovery. This would be one of the biggest discoveries in human history. Imagine it for a second. A sealed chamber is found, carefully opened, and inside, a preserved body. The first step would be identification. Scientists would analyze everything. The structure of the tomb, the materials used, any inscriptions or symbols. If a body is present, they would study it using modern forensic techniques. Possibly even DNA analysis, though that would be extremely difficult due to the age. They would also compare the findings with historical descriptions. Writings from people like Plutarch and Arrian. Details about Alexander's appearance, injuries, even the way his body was preserved. And then comes the most fascinating part. What if the body is still preserved? Not perfectly, of course. But what if traces of the original preservation method are still there? If honey was used, scientists might find chemical residues, microscopic evidence trapped in the or surrounding materials, that could finally answer the question once and for all. Was Alexander really preserved in honey? Or was it something else entirely? And that discovery wouldn't just solve a mystery. It would change how we understand ancient science. Because it would prove that people over 2,000 years ago had preservation techniques far more advanced than we imagined. But beyond science, there's something even bigger. Finding Alexander's tomb would reconnect the modern world with one of the most legendary figures in history. A man who studied under Aristotle, who conquered vast territories before most people today finish their education, and who became a legend in his own lifetime. And yet, even with all that power, all that achievement, all that history, his final resting place is still unknown. There's something almost poetic about that, because Alexander spent his entire life chasing the unknown, pushing boundaries, exploring lands no one had conquered before. And now, he has become the mystery. A king without a tomb, a legend without a location, a story without a final chapter. Maybe one day, that will change. Maybe a discovery is waiting just beneath the surface, hidden under a street, beneath the sea, or buried deep within forgotten ruins. And when that day comes, it won't just be about finding a tomb. It will be about solving one of the greatest mysteries in history. Until then, the story of Alexander the Great remains unfinished. The battles, the empire, the mysterious death, the preservation, the disappearance. We're left with one final thought. What does this story really mean? Because this isn't just about whether Alexander was preserved in honey. It's about something much bigger. Think about it. A man who once controlled lands stretching across continents, who defeated every army that stood in his way, who was taught by Aristotle himself, ended up becoming one of history's greatest mysteries. That's the irony. Alexander spent his life conquering the world. But in the end, time conquered him. And yet, not completely. Because even though his body is lost, his story isn't. We still talk about him. We still study him. We still search for him. From the ancient streets of Alexandria, to modern archaeological labs, to videos like this one, his presence is still everywhere. And maybe that's the real form of preservation. Not honey, not tombs, not gold coffins, but memory. Because honey might slow decay, but it can't stop time forever. What truly preserved Alexander was his impact. The cities he built, the cultures he connected, the legends he inspired. Even the mystery of his body has kept his name alive for over 2,000 years. And that raises one last question. What if Alexander's tomb is never found? Would that make his story weaker or stronger? Because sometimes the unknown is more powerful than the known. A discovered tomb would give us answers. But the mystery? The mystery keeps people searching. It keeps historians debating. It keeps explorers digging. It keeps stories like this alive. And maybe that's exactly how Alexander's story was meant to end. Not with a final location, not with a confirmed tomb, but with a question. A question that travels through time. From the ancient world To us. Where is Alexander? And maybe one day, someone will finally answer that. But until then, so you thought the story was over. But here's the thing about legends like Alexander's. They don't really end. They evolve. Even after everything we've covered, there's still one layer we haven't fully explored. And that is how this story changed the world after him. Because when Alexander the Great died, it didn't just create a mystery. It created a ripple effect that shaped history for centuries. His generals, the ones we talked about earlier, didn't just fight over land. They fought over identity. Each one wanted to prove, I am the true continuation of Alexander. And that's where something fascinating happens. They didn't just copy his strategies. They copied his image. Look at rulers like Ptolemy Isota. After taking Egypt, he didn't just rule as a king. He built an entire system that blended Greek and Egyptian traditions. He even connected himself symbolically to Alexander, using his legacy to strengthen his own power. And this wasn't just political. It was psychological. Because people believed in Alexander, not just as a king, but almost as something more. Some saw him as divine. Others saw him as chosen by the gods. So preserving his body, whether through honey, embalming, or both, wasn't just about keeping him intact. It was about keeping that belief alive. And it worked. Centuries after his death, rulers were still trying to live up to him, still trying to imitate him, still trying to connect themselves to his legend. Even in the Roman world, leaders like Julius Caesar admired him deeply. There's a famous story that Caesar once stood before a statue of Alexander and felt disappointed in himself. Why? Because at the same age, Alexander had already conquered the known world. That's the level of influence we're talking about. Now think about this. If Alexander's body had been lost immediately after his death, would his impact have been the same? Maybe, but maybe not. Because the physical presence of his body, preserved, displayed, protected, made his legend feel real. It gave people something to see, something to connect with, something to believe in. And that's powerful. Even today, we're still fascinated by it. The idea that a human body could survive centuries, that it could travel across empires, that it could become a symbol of power long after death. It feels almost unreal. But that's exactly why this story continues to capture attention. Because it sits right at the intersection of history, science, myth, and mystery. And the honey? Whether it's 100% confirmed or not, it represents something deeper. It represents humanity's attempt to fight time, to preserve what matters, to hold on to greatness, even when it's gone. And in Alexander's case, it worked. Not just physically, but symbolically. Because more than 2,000 years later, we're still here, talking about him, still asking questions, still searching for answers. And maybe that's the real reason this story matters. Not because we know everything, but because we don't. Because the mystery invites us in. It makes us curious. It makes us explore. And who knows? Maybe one day, you'll be watching the news and see a headline that changes everything. Alexander the Great's tomb finally discovered. And when that happens, you'll remember this story. You'll remember the honey. the journey, the disappearance, and you'll realize you were part of the mystery all along. So even after everything, the mystery, the science, the disappearance, the global impact, there's still one final layer most people never think about. What if the story of Alexander's preserved body was never just about preservation at all? What if it was about control over history itself? Because think about who controlled Alexander after he died. Not his family, not his people, but his generals. Men like Ptolemy Isota didn't just inherit land. They inherited a story. And stories are powerful. Sometimes even more powerful than armies. By taking Alexander's body to Egypt, Ptolemy wasn't just moving a corpse. He was rewriting geography. He was shifting the center of Alexander's legacy from Macedonia to Egypt, and more specifically, to Alexandria. That decision changed history. Because Alexandria didn't just become a city. It became a symbol. A place of knowledge, power, and culture. It eventually housed the famous Library of Alexandria, one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. And right there, in that same city, was the body of Alexander. Think about the message that sends. Knowledge and power, side by side. A conqueror who shaped the world, and a city that tried to understand it. Now here's where it gets even deeper. Over time, the image of Alexander started to change. In some cultures, he was remembered as a hero. In others, as a legend. In some stories, almost as a mythical figure. From Greece to Persia, from Egypt to India, his story was retold in different ways. And in many of those versions, his death and preservation became symbolic. Not just a historical event, but a kind of transformation. A transition from man to legend. And that's where the idea of honey becomes even more interesting. Because honey, across many ancient cultures, was associated with immortality. It didn't rot. It didn't decay. It lasted. So preserving Alexander in honey wasn't just practical. It was symbolic. It was like saying, this man will not fade. And in a way, he didn't. Even as empires fell, even as cities changed, even as his tomb disappeared, his name survived. And not just survived. It spread. Stories about Alexander reached places he never even conquered. His legend traveled further than his armies ever did. That's rare. Most conquerors are remembered for what they did. But Alexander? He's remembered for what he became. A symbol of ambition. A symbol of power. A symbol of the unknown. And the mystery of his body only adds to that. Because we're not just asking, where is he buried? We're asking, what happened to a man who seemed unstoppable? And maybe that's why this story keeps coming back. Because it reminds us of something real. No matter how powerful someone becomes, no matter how much they achieve, there's always something beyond control. Time, memory, history. And yet, sometimes, if the story is strong enough, a part of them lives on anyway. Not in a tomb, not in a body, but in the minds of people, centuries later. So maybe Alexander didn't need a perfect tomb. Maybe he didn't need to be fully preserved forever. Because in the end, he achieved something even greater. He became unforgettable. At this point, you already know the story. The rise, the conquest, the sudden death, the preservation, the disappearance. But now, let's step back one last time. Not as historians, not as archaeologists, but as observers of something deeper. Because the story of Alexander the Great isn't just history. It's a pattern we've seen again and again. Throughout human civilization, a single individual rises, faster than anyone expects, achieves more than anyone thought possible, changes the world in ways that can't be undone. And then, they're gone, leaving behind questions. What made them different? How did they do it? And what remains after they disappear? In Alexander's case, what remained wasn't just an empire, because that empire didn't last. It fractured, split between men like Ptolemy I Soter and Seleucus I Nicator, reshaped into new kingdoms, and eventually absorbed into other powers. So if the empire didn't survive, what did? His idea did. The idea that one person could push beyond limits. That the known world wasn't the boundary, just the beginning. And that idea spread everywhere. From the Mediterranean, to Asia, to cultures that never even met him directly. Now think about the body again. Preserved in honey, or not. Protected, displayed, lost. In the end, it didn't matter as much as people thought it would. Because the physical body was never the most powerful part of Alexander. His story was. And stories don't decay. They don't disappear like tombs. They don't sink beneath cities like Alexandria. They adapt. They travel. They survive. Even now, thousands of years later, someone is watching this, listening to this, thinking about this. And that means Alexander is still here. Not physically, not in a tomb, but in memory. And maybe that's the ultimate form of preservation. More powerful than honey, more lasting than stone, more resilient than empires. Because even if we never find his body, we've already found something greater. A legacy that refuses to disappear. And maybe that's the real ending to this story. Not a discovered tomb. Not a final answer. But a realization that some figures in history don't need to be found. Because they were never truly lost. You made it this far. Which means one thing. This wasn't just a story for you. Because most people hear about Alexander the Great. And they stop at the obvious. The battles. The victories. The empire. But you didn't stop there. You followed the story after the ending. And that's where the real mystery was hiding. Because history doesn't just live in what happened. It lives in what happened next. And in Alexander's case, what happened next was something no one expected. A body became a symbol. A symbol became power. And power became a story that refused to die. Think about that transformation. At first, his body needed protection. Possibly through honey. Possibly through ancient embalming. Something to hold back decay. Then, it became something else. A political weapon. Controlled by Ptolemy I Soter. Displayed in Alexandria. Used to legitimize rule. To convince people that the legacy of Alexander lived on through new kings. And for a long time, that worked. But then something unexpected happened. The symbol outgrew the object. People no longer needed to see the body to believe in the legend. The story became enough. And when that happens, something interesting takes place. The physical object, the body, the tomb, the location, becomes less important. And slowly, almost quietly, it disappears. Not because it wasn't valuable, but because it was no longer necessary. That might sound strange, but it's something we see again and again in history. At first, people protect physical things, artifacts, relics, bodies. But over time, ideas replace them. And ideas are much harder to destroy. That's exactly what happened with Alexander. Even if his body was perfectly preserved, even if it lasted for centuries, it couldn't compete with what his story became. A legend that moved across cultures. A name that symbolized greatness. A figure that people compared themselves to. Long after he was gone. Even powerful leaders, centuries later, still measured themselves against him. That's not normal. Most rulers fade into history books. But Alexander? He became a standard. And that's why the mystery of his body still matters. Not because we need it to understand history, but because we want to complete the story. Humans don't like unfinished endings. We want closure. We want answers. We want to know. Where is he? What happened? Was the honey real? Is the tomb still out there? But maybe, just maybe, this is one story that was never meant to be fully closed. Because as long as the answer is missing, the story stays alive. People keep searching, keep questioning, keep telling it again and again and again. And that keeps Alexander alive in a way no tomb ever could. So in the end, maybe the real question isn't, where is Alexander the Great? Maybe the real question is, why are we still looking for him? Because the answer to that tells us just as much about ourselves as it does about him. Now that we've traced the life, death, preservation, disappearance, and ongoing mystery of Alexander the Great, it's time to step back and reflect on the true meaning of it all. Because while we've focused on honey, tombs, and archaeology, the deeper story isn't physical. It's human. Alexander's journey shows us what happens when ambition, genius, and legend collide. He conquered vast lands, changed cultures, and inspired generations, all before most of us even finish our first major challenge in life. And the preservation in honey? It represents human desire to control legacy, to stop time, to make greatness permanent. But here's the truth. No matter how well you preserve something, time and change are inevitable. Bodies decay. Empires crumble. Cities sink. Tombs are lost. But stories, ideas, legends, those are immortal. Alexander's physical body may have disappeared. His tomb may be lost beneath Alexandria or the sea. But his influence continues. From rulers like Julius Caesar and Augustus, to modern historians, writers, and filmmakers, his life still sparks curiosity, study, imagination. And that is the real form of preservation. Not honey, not gold, not glass coffins, but in memory, in legend, in inspiration. Alexander teaches us something timeless. You can't stop time. You can't control everything. But you can leave a mark so powerful that even thousands of years later, People are still talking about you, still searching for you, still learning from you. And maybe that's why we are fascinated by the honey story. It's more than a preservation method. It's a symbol of humanity's attempt to grasp immortality. So what should we take away from this? Legends aren't preserved in substances. They are preserved in influence, in curiosity, in questions. And Alexander, more than 2,300 years later, remains alive in exactly that way. We started with a body preserved in honey, a corpse that defied decay, a king whose death should have been the end. But history had other plans, because Alexander's real preservation wasn't in honey. It was in legend, in the way his story shaped empires, in the way it inspired rulers, thinkers, and dreamers long after he was gone. The body may have vanished. The tomb may be buried under Alexandria or lost to time. But Alexander lives. He lives in ambition. He lives in curiosity. He lives in the idea that one person can challenge the world and leave a mark no one can erase. And that's the ultimate truth behind the honey. It was never just about stopping decay. It was about humanity's attempt to touch immortality. Alexander's story shows us power and legacy can outlast empires. Influence can outlast tombs. Legends are stronger than gold, glass, or even time itself. Even today, over 2,300 years later, we are still searching, still asking questions, still fascinated by the mystery of his body, his tomb, and the man himself. And maybe that's the point. Some answers aren't meant to be found. Some mysteries are meant to keep us searching. And some legends are meant to be immortal. You can preserve a body in honey, but true immortality is preserved in time, story, and memory. And Alexander the Great? He is eternal.